But today's daf is daf mem, and we start with Tana Rabbanon, and the Brisa records a machlokes between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. And the question is whether you put tzitzis on a beged of pishtan, and specifically, we're talking about putting tcheles, and tcheles is made of wool. The beged is made of linen in this particular case. And Beit Shammai, Beit Shammai say don't put tzitzis of tcheles of wool onto a beged of linen. Beis Hillel mechayvim v'alochi k'divrei Beis Hillel. Omer Rebbe Loza b'Reb Tzadok v'lo kol hamatil tcheles b'Yushalayim einu elo min hamatmiyim. In Yerushalayim, the minig was established by the Chachamim of Yerushalayim that you don't wear tzitzis of tcheles of wool on a beged of pishtan, because the Rabbanan prohibited it. Amar Rebbe in Kein Lo Masrua. Why did the Chachamim prohibit it when even the Chachmei Yerushalayim agree in principle to Beis Hillel that the Torah permits it? Why did the Rabbanan go ahead and prohibit it? Lefisha ein b'kiyah, because people won't realize that because of the mitzvah of tzitzis, therefore you're allowed to override kilayim. They won't understand that. They're going to start thinking, well, look at the great rabbis who are they're wearing kilayim, they're wearing woolen tzitzis on a beged of pishtan. Apparently, you're allowed to do that. So why don't we get 10 people together out in the shuk and just publicize that this is a special occasion, special situation in which we apply the principle of esei dochalos. I said the mitzvah of tzitzis allows you to override kilayim. So Gemara says, Kol shkei d'mishamu ilon. People are going to start seeing 10 people out there, and they're all like demonstrating that you're allowed to do this thing. They're going to be wondering, what's this all about? They're going to be totally amazed by this. They're going to think that they're going out there to publicize that there's no Isur Shatnes. For Lidrosh Bepirko, but every yontif there was a public lecture. Why not use that occasion to notify the people that we are allowed to put woolen tcheles onto a beged of pishtan because of the mitzvah of tzitzis. And Gemara says gzeira mishum kol ha'ilon, because many people would unfortunately be fooled, and they're going to put kol ha'ilon, which is a fake dye that looks like tcheles, and the sellers make big bucks because they pawn it off in the marketplace as tcheles, and it's not really tcheles. And therefore you're not going to be mekayim the mitzvah. And if you're not mekayim the mitzvah, then you violate the Isur of kilayim. So the Gemara asks, why are you violating the Isur Kilayim? Even if the dye is not the real, genuine, the real thing, as they say in Coca-Cola, right? But it's really just a fake. But nevertheless, the chutim, forget about the dye, are no worse than chutei lavan. And we paskin that ein hatchelis makeves sal lavan, and therefore you can fulfill the mitzvah with lavan. And the Gemara now introduces a new principle with regard to esei dochalosas. Keva the efshar b'minam lo. K'reish lakish dom reish lakish rakush atamotzei esei dochalosas. Ima teyochol l'kayim eshnei mutavim lav yavo esei v'yidchalosas. So we only are dochalosas when there's no other option to achieve the mitzvah. But in this case, that you're talking about chutei lavan, that chutei lavan could be made of linen. So the tzitzis itself is produced from linen, and therefore you completely circumvent the Isur Kilayim because now you're putting linen onto linen. And the only time that it's efshar is when you have to use the woolen tzitzis, the woolen chutei tzitzis for the purpose of tcheles. But if now you're using a fake tcheles, and it's not the real tcheles, it's not, it's kol ha'ilon, it's indigo and not tcheles, then okay, it's lavan, but you could have avoided the kilayim by taking wool, by taking linen and making chutei tzitzis of lavan out of linen, which again you can't do with tchelis, but you could do it with linen, and then you're putting linen onto linen, and there's no kilayim. Frek the Gemara v'livda kuhu. What is this whole business that we're afraid that maybe the blue color here that the chutim were dyed? Maybe it's kol ha'ilon. Why not just subject it to some sort of a scientific test and make an examination and determine whether or not it's it's indigo or it's real tcheles. And then if we discover through this test that the dye is the real thing and it's really tcheles, then we'll apply the principle of esei dochalos haseh. And it's a case of the efshar. And if it's the efshar, then we override the isa. So why not just check it out? Why not just do an inspection? So the Gemara says, you know what? You're right. I got to drop my case. Now I have to come up with a whole new explanation why the Chachmei Yushalayim prohibited putting tcheles onto a beged of pishtan, sadin. El gzeira mishum te'ima. What happens is that in order to test and determine whether or not this is real tcheles or it's kala ilan, they used a certain thread for the testing, and then that thread afterwards, again, that thread is tcheles. They're going to somehow, I don't know how they do it exactly, but so after the test is over, they're going to take that very thread and they're going to use it as tzitzis because that thread is real, genuine tcheles. So they're going to attach it to the garment. But the truth is that you cannot be mekayim the mitzvah with that thread. Why? So this has to do with the sugya, which I don't think we got to yet, and that is lishma, which means that when you prepared this thread and you put the tcheles into the thread, then you didn't do so for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, but rather you did it for the sake of this test. And therefore, if there's no lishma in the addition of tcheles to the chutei lavan, then it's possible. And if it's possible, once again, we violate the iser of kilayim. Frek the Gemara v'lichtava ad diskei. Why don't the Rabbanan, as they always do when they have to testify to something, they write a document and they send it out to all places with their, signatures, and then they could notify the people. Like for example, today you go for shatnez testing, right? So what do? They attach a certain I don't know what you call it, a chosemes, to indicate that it's free of shatnez, and therefore after the test, what they could do is they could write on a document that this particular thread that was used for testing and therefore wasn't made lishma is disqualified and don't go near it. And the rest of the tzitzios are okay. They were done lishma. So let's notify the people through these documents and sign them and seal them. That's a kashrus, a tudat kashrut for tzitzis. So the Gemara says, "Adiske likum v'lismoch." Are we going to rely on a document that we send out? I mean, maybe somebody will counterfeit the document, and you can't put all your value in written notes. You can't rely on the people out there to trust these documents. So Amar Rava, and Rava is going to now prove that in fact we do rely on documents, and that's how we get away with Yom Kippur. Now we're on Daf Mem Amud Beis, and Chometz Pesach v'Yom Kippurim Dekares and Samchin and Adiski. What happens? Every couple of years, let's say every 3 years or so, the Chachamim are ma'aber the Shana. They add an extra month to the year, an extra Adar, and as a result, Pesach is pushed off by a month. Now, how do the people know that? How do we notify them? Because if we don't notify them, they're going to eat chametz on Pesach. They don't realize that Pesach is a month later. Or, for example, they might violate Yom Kippur. And the answer is that even though we're talking about prohibitions of the most severe nature that generate a chiyuv kares if you violate them, nevertheless, we rely on on these documents that are sent out to all the different kilot in Yisrael. Is hacha di esei bi'alma? Now you're talking about a mitzvah aseh. is low kolshkin, how much more so that we should certainly certainly rely on, on these documents. People will rely on documents. So again, as far as Yom Kippur, I just want to point out that once you add an extra month to the year, it changes or pushes off Yom Kippur by a month. So what would have been the 10th of Tishrei is now the 10th of El. No, just so let me get it the other way around. Right. In other words, no, I mean the 10th of Tishrei will now be the 10th of El. I'm sorry, I got it wrong. The 10th of Tishrei will be the 10th of Cheshvan. All right, anyway, El Amarava, now we have to come up with a whole new idea to explain the Chachmei Yushalayim, why they prohibited putting tzitzis of tcheles onto a beged of pishtan, hamilse, amri. This is what they said over here in our Gegen here in Bavel, v'itma b'marava, and they sent it to Eretz Yisrael, mishum d'Rabbi Zera kavase, because this is a statement that's said in the name of Rabbi Zera, Shemi Yikaris Dino betoch sholosh v'isperenu, etc. Okay, what happens now? Let's say, for example, you have a tear in your garment. Now, if the tear in the garment reaches down to the very corner, and the knaf, the corner is up to 3 etzbos, so if, let's say, the tear hit those 3 etzbos, then people don't realize that they can't just sew it up. What they have to do is they have to sew it up, take off the tzitzis, and put the tzitzis on again. And that's the principle of Tasa V'Lo Asli. So they're not aware of that. And therefore, what they're going to do is they're going to just leave the tzitzis in its place, even though the beged is possible because it was ripped in the corner within 3 etzbos. And they're going to leave the tzitzis and fix the beged, fix the corner, without taking off the tzitzis. Fatorah Omra, Tasa V'Lo Asli. You need an asiyah, which means you have to put the tzitzis on a beged when you're chayav in tzitzis. But here, the tzitzis is already on the beged and it's potter because there's no knaf, there's no corner. The corner was ripped. Now, if they assume that the tzitzis are kosher because they don't realize they're not aware of Tasav V'Lo as a psul, then they're going to violate the Yisur Kilayim. That's what the Chachmei Yushalayim were worried about. And Shara Rab Zera L'Sdina, and Rabbi Zera actually took off the tzitzis and he put it back on again. So this was the Rab Zera that Rava had made reference to earlier. Okay. Now we're going to have a sugya about Ksus Laila. Now let's explain. You have a beged that you only wear at night, and in the parsha of Tzitzis it says Ureisem Oso, which excludes Laila. So therefore, Abzera Omar Gzera Mishum Ksus Laila, if we allow him to put woolen tzitzis on a beged of Pishnan, he might do so even on his, we'll call it pajamas. And there's no chiv tzitzis on pajamas, and therefore he's going to violate the Yisur Kilayim because there's no mitzvah tzitzis. So we have so many different explanations to justify the Chachamim in Yerushalayim making this gzera. V'yamar Rava ha milsa amri v'itma b'rava mishmei Rab Zera kavasi. Right, there's something again that I taught here in Bavel, and in Eretz Yisrael they attributed to Rab Zera, Rab Zeira or Zera. He shall beged knafer shel or chayeves he shall or v'knafer shel beged p'tura. My timer iker beged be'inon. People may make a mistake and think that everything depends on the knaf, on the corner. So now we're talking about situations in which the beged itself is made of a material that's not chayev in tzitzis, but the knaf, the corners of the beged, are made of a material that's chayev in tzitzis. And the principle is, and that's what we hear from Rava and Rab Zira, that Iker beged be'inon. We don't look at the corners, but rather the main part of the garment itself. And therefore, if let's say you have a case of corners that are made of leather, leather does not obligate you in tzitzis. It's not considered a cloth. It's made from hides of animals. So since the main beged is made of cloth, despite the fact that the corners are leather corners, sounds like a cool idea. Maybe we should start manufacturing it. Anyway, it's chayiv in tzitzis because the main beged is made of cloth. But in the reverse case, where the main beged is a leather garment and the corners are made of cloth, then you're potter from tzitzis. Rav Achi Osi Basil Kanaf. However, Rav Achai says, no, I disagree with Rav and Rav Zira, and I hold that the Ikar, as far as tzitzis, is the kanaf, is the corner, which means that even if the beggar was made of or, if the corners are made of cloth, you're chayiv in tzitzis. Omar Rava, Omar Rav Schor, Omar Rav Huna. Hitil, this is an interesting sugi. A beged, to be chayiv in tzitzis, has to have 4 corners. And now he put tzitzis on a beged that only has 3 corners. And then, afterwards, he added an extra corner to his garment. It's psula. Once again, we're going to apply the principle of tasav lo asli, meaning when you put on the 3 tzitzios, you only had 3 corners on the beged, and you were potter from tzitzis. So what you're going to have to do when you add the 4th corner is you have to now take off the 3 tzitzios and put them back on. Meisvei, the Gemara asks a question from a brisa. Chasidim arishonim came into argu bosh shalosh haymatim lotcheles. They hadn't complete the garment, and what happened was that the garment needs completion of 3 etzbos. Let's say the amount of the corner that's missing now is 3 etzbos, which means, as we said before, it's not a kanaf. And they put the tzitzis on already on 3 on 3 out of the 4 before it was chayiv in tzitzis. So the Gemara answers, "Ema kevan shepatzu ba shalosh haymatilin lot cheles." Now, how does this answer the question? They wouldn't wait until the talus was completed. They would have fixed the tzitzis before it was completed, because they're so zaris in the mitzvah. Once they had woven to within 3 finger breadths, it wasn't that they were above the 3 etzbos, and 3 etzbos were missing. No, they already dipped into the 3 etzbos, and they would already put tzitzis on all 4 corners. So again, how does that solve our problem? He says the following: at this point, even the last 2 corners were fit to have tzitzis attached, since when the garment would be completed, these tzitzis would be in their proper place within 3 finger breadths of the edge. Thus, although these tzitzis were affixed before the talus was actually finished, they were not considered tasav lo min ha'asli. So this is fascinating. If I understand the sugya correctly, the answer that Rav is giving to explain the price of these Hasidim is a radical breakthrough in the whole understanding of tzitzis and tasav lo min ha'asli in tzitzis. He's saying the following, that even though he doesn't have 4 corners yet, and the beggar therefore doesn't generate a chiyuv tzitzis, but nevertheless, if he, within those corners, he got below 3 handbreadths, etzbos, finger breadths, then that corner itself is a chefza shel mitzvah. Yeah, you have to introduce a little brisker lumdus over here. It's a chefza shel mitzvah, right? Because he can add a little bit to complete it, but he already has enough so that when he has all four corners prepared, that corner is already a kanaf because he got below the three finger breadths. So again, it's not a problem of tasalo and also because when he put on the tzitzis on that corner was already complete as far as the mitzvah of tzitzis is concerned. And even though the beged in its entirety is not completed, because there are other corners that haven't yet been completed, that they didn't even reach below the three finger breadths, nevertheless, it's not tasav and also. But I mean, you see clearly from this Gemara that tzitzis is not just a matter of the Maisa Gavra, the action, but it's also a din in the Chefta. Once the Chefta, the Kanaf, is a Kanaf to generate tzitzis, although I need another three, that Kanaf takes on the identity of a Chefta Shel tzitzis, as if to say there's already a quasi chiyuv to put on tzitzis, and therefore it's not Tasav Lomenos. Omar Rava. Just 1 second. Oh, wait a minute. I think I skipped something. Oh, yeah. What happens? This is a sugi that I was referring to before. He puts on a second round of tzitzis while he still has the first round. So he's got now 2 tzitzios on each corner, all told 8 tzitzios. And his intention was to remove the first round of tzitzis and leave the second round. And that should be a problem of tasavol and osis. The Gemara asks for Vamar Abizera Hitil Mutelis Kshera. If you already have mutelis, you already have tzitzis on the 4 corners, and now you put on another tzitzis, pair of tzitzis on each one of the corners, then it's kshera, meaning just remove the first round. If you follow me, remove the old tzitzios and leave it as it is. You don't have to take off the new ones and put it back on again. Why isn't that a violation of the principle and a disqualification under the principle of tasav lo and asa? Now, let's keep in mind, the motivating or, how should I say, the generating factor here that we have to consider is what's called baltosif. If you put 2 tzitzios on a beged, then you violate baltosif. So if you violated baltosif, then that asiya, when he put the second pair of tzitzis on, we'll call it the new pair of tzitzis, is not valid. It can't be valid if it's a violation of baltosif. Omar Rava hashta baltosif koi maisa lo havi. Again, this is this is profound lumdus here. Rav is saying the following. It's not possible to call something an asiya, in this case an asiya of tzitzis, when at the same time you're violating an avera. And therefore that asiya is suspended in midair, so to speak, and will only gain the status of an asiya after you circumvent and solve, or shall we say neutralize, the problem of baltosif. So when he puts on the second pair of tzitzis, right now he's in a baltosif mode. And therefore that asiya cannot qualify as an asiya. Once he removes the old pair of tzitzis, now his asiya, so to speak, retroactively becomes an asiya. So it's taseh, and it's not asur. Maskif lo Rav Papa doesn't doesn't accept this. Mimai de gavlo sufi kamachaven timul vatule kamachaven ubaltosif leka and maisa ika. Why, Rav, are you assuming that when he puts on the second pair of tzitzis on top of the first, he violates baltosif, which negates the asiya, and allows the Asi to become an Asi later on when he removes the first. No, maybe he had no intention whatsoever of violating Bal Tosif. All he wanted to do was get rid of the original tzitzis, to nullify them. And therefore, what does he do? He first puts on the second pair of tzitzis, and then he takes off the first pair of tzitzis. So therefore, there is no Bal Tosif. So Rav Papa argues if there's no Bal Tosif, then his putting on the tzitzis is a Maisa, and at that point, the Beged is not Chayv and tzitzis, or he has tzitzis, and therefore it's Tasev Lo Ben Asui. So I don't think the Gemara answers this question. Just one second. Rabbi Zera teaches us that when the original tzitzis are removed, the garment is fit for wearing on the base of the new tzitzis. So therefore, we see that tzitzis that are made when they're not required to be made are valid. Just one second. Tzitzis that are made, it's considered asiyah because, again, according to our Papa, there's no Bal Tosif, and yet the beged right now is not chayiv in tzitzis, and yet it's considered a valid asiyah. So you have a valid asiyah on a beged that's not chayiv in tzitzis. So therefore, this refutes your teaching that if one affixes tzitzis to a three-cornered garment and then adds the fourth corner, it is unfit. So I don't know, at this point, it seems that when do we apply the principle of Tasev Lo Ben Asui only to tzitzis that were originally invalid, but not to tzitzis that were unnecessary. So if tzitzis are made in an invalid manner, they were initially affixed for the purpose of sewing, they are surely disqualified because of Tasev Lo Ben Asui, and that's what Rava taught on the top of this Omud. And Rabbi Zera concurred. If tzitzis were made before the requirement sets in, like for example an incomplete garment or a three-cornered garment, their status is disputed. Rava maintains that this is possible under Tasev Lo Ben Asui. Rav Papa maintains that they are not disqualified. So when does Rav Papa apply the principle of Tasev Lo Ben Asui? Only to a case of tzitzis that were originally invalid. But if it's unnecessary, but it's not invalid, then that's not called Tasev Lo Ben Asui. So when you add a second pair of tzitzis to a garment that already has valid tzitzis, Reb Zera is going to apply the principle of Tasev Lo Ben Asui, and Rav Papa will not. Rava maintains that because he affixed an extra pair of tzitzis, he violates the prohibition of Bal Tosif, and therefore the new tzitzis are not considered asiyah. Rav Papa maintains that the prohibition is not necessarily violated, therefore the new tzitzis may have been made initially. Right, there is an asiyah. But since, as we said before, according to Rav Papa, the only time I apply the principle of Tasev Lo Ben Asui is tzitzis that were originally invalid. Here, the tzitzis are unnecessary because he already has tzitzis, but it's not invalid. All right, let's just see if we can finish up. Omer Rab Zera, Omer Mas Omer Shmuel, Tcheles Ein Ba Mishum Kilayim. Ve'afilu bitalis ptura. Now this is amazing. We just finished saying that Esei Dochalosa overrides the Isur Kilayim, but only because it's a chiyuv and a mitzvah of tzitzis. What about of talis ptura? So the Gemara asks, my talis ptura. If you're going to tell me that it doesn't have the shear, meaning it's a very small garment that even a child cannot wrap himself in, and therefore what? You're going to be doche the Isur Kilayim. V'atanya, we learned in the Brisa Talish Ekot Miskasebo Rosh of Arubo. V'agol Yotzi Bo B'derech Aroy. Even if a man, an adult man, we're here on Daf Mem Aleph, will only go out there on a temporary basis. Chayeves B'tzitzis. But Eina Kot Miskasebo Rosh of Arubo. If it's impossible, then Afal Pishagol Yotzi Bo Aroy. Even though an adult will go out on a temporary basis, P'tura. V'chein Linyin Kalayim. Vavinim bo, and we ask, what is v'chein b'inyan kilayim? Ilem v'chein b'inyan isura de kilayim, that he violates the isur of kilayim. Well, if anan tanan ena roy b'kilayim, right? So if you only wear it on a temporary basis, there's no aver of kilayim. The Omer of Nachbar Yitzchak v'chein linyan sadim b'tzitzis. So again, if the beged is large enough to cover a minor, and an adult can wear it temporarily, the tzitzis are beyond the violation of shatnez because there's a chiv tzitzis, a mitzvah tzitzis. If it lacks this measure, the tzitzis are not do. Then you are not mekayim the mitzvah tzitzis, and therefore you have a violation of the isur kalayim. So we see clearly that the prohibition of kilayim does apply to tzitzis placed on a garment that's exempt. Why did Reb Zera say that when the tzitzis is not subject to prohibition of kilayim, like for example, it's not large enough that nevertheless you don't violate kilayim? Elamai P'tura, the Gemara answers, what did Reb Zera mean when he said a talis P'tura? Hitel limuteles. Right, it's a case where he added, as we said before, another extra round of tzitzis to a beggar that already has tzitzis on it. And that's not considered a violation of shatnez. And that's called a talis p'tura. And why is it? Because as we said before, it's a cheftz of tzitzis. And even though the beged in general is not chayav in tzitzis, because it already has tzitzis, but nevertheless you are putting on something that's valid in tzitzis. And if he removes the first pairs of tzitzis, then so frek the Gemara v'amar Reb Zera chadazim, the Gemara answers chadu mechlal dechavrta itmar. Okay, this is where we'll stop for today. I'll take this opportunity to wish you a great Shabbos, and